Welcome to Nice and Blunt. It's week 4, and these are my quarterback, tight end, and defensive rankings entering the weekend. We're going to be ranking quarterbacks first. To start, I want to bring up some matchup stats. This chart shows you every single defense in the NFL and how many points per game they're allowing to the quarterback position. So there are some clear and obvious upgrades at the top of this chart. The top two are significantly better matchups than everyone else so far. So I think you have to start Jordan Love this week versus the Cowboys. They just made Caleb Williams look elite with almost 300 yards, 4 touchdowns, no turnovers, and they've been torched by Russell Wilson as well. I really think Dallas is the spot to trust all year. In primetime, I think Jordan Love deserves a massive upgrade and needs to be in your lineup. The Dolphins have also been a terrible defense, 5+ points more than any other team other than Dallas, and that means Justin Fields will put up some good stats on them. I think Justin Fields is a lock in your lineup if healthy this week. So those two matchups are clearly better than everyone else, but I still think there's some decent positive upgrades still to speak of. The next 3 teams all give up more than 21 fantasy points per game as well, and that would be the Pittsburgh Steelers going up against Carson Wentz in Dublin this week. Also, Chicago is a very good matchup, top 5 at the position, so Geno Smith gets another upgrade. And then Buffalo has also been pretty susceptible against quarterbacks as well. Part of that is Lamar Jackson running on them, but even Tua played pretty well before the pick in the fourth quarter last week. I think Spencer Rattler does have some garbage time appeal, one of his better games probably of the season. Beyond that point, above 20 points allowed is Detroit, coming in 6th place on this list. And that means Joe Flacco maybe plays better, but he's been too irrelevant in fantasy to actually start. That one kind of irrelevant. But New Orleans is a positive matchup for Josh Allen, so everyone is definitely starting Josh Allen. And then these next 5 teams are all pretty much identical at 18.5, 18.7, and 18.6 points per game allowed. So Washington comes in against Michael Penix. He probably looks better than he did against Carolina. And then the Jets have also been a pretty vulnerable defense, so Tua at home off extra rest might deserve an upgrade as well. Everyone is already going to start Jalen Hurts, but the Bucs have been a top 10 matchup themselves. And then Baltimore also ranks as an upgrade, giving up 18.5 points. Against Mahomes, there is some rushing value that'll pad the numbers. And then the last matchup to mention before it starts to fall off would be the New York Giants going up against Justin Herbert, but Herbert has looked like an MVP. I think anyone who has Herbert is starting them in their lineup. So those are the top 12 matchups. And then there's Las Vegas and the Chargers, which also give up over 17 points per game themselves. And then there's a pretty flat tier, and I'll mention the downgrades. Once we dip below 14 points, that's when it starts to be a little relevant. But the worst matchup on this chart does belong to Carolina. Just ask Michael Penix last week. They are a brutal spot. So they go on the road against Drake Maye this week. I would be downgrading Drake Maye. Less than 10 points allowed per game is pretty bad. So I don't think Drake Maye is the safest bet. Probably a decent floor like always, but maybe not an upgrade like he got against Miami. And then the Packers have also been an elite defense. Dak without CeeDee Lamb, a massive downgrade for him. The Vikings probably going to lock up Aaron Rodgers. Their defense looks very good so far. And then these next 3, all around 12.5 points per game. The Colts going up against Stafford in LA. Probably still give up some touchdowns. I wouldn't worry too much about Stafford there. That's probably a shootout. So that one, I don't fear too much. But bottom 5 as well would be Atlanta going against Marcus Mariota. Maybe you don't trust Mariota as much this week. But Seattle was a downgrade for Kyler Murray. I told you to bench him last night. That looked like a relatively decent call. And then the Titans and Denver both tied at 13.3. That means CJ Stroud, a player we're not starting, deserves a downgrade. And then Jake Browning, another quarterback we're not starting either, also gets a downgrade. Lastly, the Niners and Houston are also giving up less than 14 points, which means Trevor Lawrence against San Francisco, not a safe play. And also Cam Ward has yet to earn your trust, not a safe play either. I'll ignore the average matchups between 14.6 and 16 points per game allowed. So that's it for the upgrades and downgrades at the position. Now I would like to get to my rankings at quarterback. And number 1 and 2 will stay consistent until there's someone that really emerges way better than them. I'm going to keep Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen in that elite top 2 tier. And this week I am starting Allen above Lamar. It's an automatic start for both, but the Saints do rank as the 7th best quarterback matchup. The Chiefs have been league average. So on paper, Allen gets an upgrade. He also gets extra rest. They played last Thursday, and everyone's going to torch New Orleans. Allen is my top quarterback. But interestingly enough, for Lamar Jackson, he's elite on the ground when he plays the Chiefs. In Lamar's last 3 games versus Kansas City, he's averaging 25.5 points per game and averaging 13 rush attempts per game for 94 rushing yards on average. The last 2 games, he has gone over 100 yards rushing. He also has 2 rushing touchdowns in those 3 games. So I think in terms of player projections on Underdog, I think the higher on Lamar Jackson rushing yards is a decent stance to take. I think Lamar will crush on the ground against the Chiefs. Definitely a lock in your lineup, as always. But at number 3, I'm going to put Justin Fields as the next best start. The Dolphins rank as the 2nd best quarterback matchup this season, giving up 26.3 points per game. We mentioned it on the chart, well above everyone but Dallas. And they've also given up 6 passing touchdowns and 3 rushing touchdowns. Not a single turnover forced by the Miami Dolphins. So I think Fields is going to have a clean stat sheet. I think he's definitely scoring a rushing touchdown. He should dominate against one of the worst defenses in the NFL. It looks like he'll suit up. He was full in practice on Thursday, and we'll get the full practice reports throughout the week, but I think in tomorrow's injury update video, I expect Fields to be deemed active, will play on Monday. That's the only downside. It's a Monday game, so if he does not suit up, you have limited options to pivot to. You'd have to choose between Tua, Bo Nix, or Jake Browning if you are waiting on Fields. Ideally, you have Bo Nix, but if you have to start Tua, that would pretty much be a death nail. That would suck. So I think he'll play. If he does, I think you have to start him. The matchup is elite. At number 4, we got Jalen Hurts at Tampa Bay. And last week, I was definitely wrong to doubt him and downgrade him in the ranks. So I'm going to put him back in the top 5. I think the matchup is better for Fields, however, and that's why I have Hurts behind Justin Fields. But they're both rushing quarterbacks. I expect a rushing touchdown for Hurts. And odds are against Tampa, it turns into a shootout. Similar to the Rams game, I think they're going to have to throw and keep up with Tampa on the scoreboard. But I would like to acknowledge Hurts does not play well against Todd Bowles and the Bucs defense. He's 1-4 in his 5 career games versus the Bucs, and in fantasy, he's not doing very well. An average of 17.5 points per game is well below average, what you expect from Hurts in general. So his average stat line is 211 yards per game passing, only 27 rushing yards per game. They've actually contained his scramble ability against the Bucs. It's not been his best spot overall. He also only has 5 passing touchdowns in those 5 games, only 1 per game on average. He does add 4 rushing touchdowns in that sample size, however, but also 6 turnovers. They have had his number for the most part. So if you're getting less than 20 fantasy points from Hurts on average, I don't think he deserves an elite ranking, but he was so good last week, and the Rams were also a tough defense. I think he'll be fine. I think if you drafted Hurts, you probably don't even have a backup, so I think you have to start him, and I think odds are he'll still be a plus 20-point player in fantasy. I think he'll still get you what you need to stay in the lineup. I still think he's top 5. Last week, he proved me wrong to fade him. At number 5, we got Jordan Love at Dallas, and I mentioned it similar to Justin Fields against the Dolphins. This matchup is such an upgrade, you have to plug him in to the lineup. So last week, I ranked Caleb Williams as my number 3 quarterback, and he finished as the QB1 in fantasy. And I think Jordan Love does benefit just as much as Caleb Williams does. So I'm more of the belief that the Cowboys are just that bad and such a big upgrade in fantasy rather than Caleb Williams is like a lock to be a top 3 quarterback every week. I'm going to believe that this matchup is one you want to go after, and that's why I will rank Jordan Love as a top 5 play this week. He doesn't run a ton, but he does offer enough to move the needle there. I don't think he has a single turnover in this game, and I think off the Browns loss, LaFleur is going to dial up some deep passes. I think Golden and Dobbs are going to connect for some, and I also think Tucker Kraft will play well. The only risk is if Josh Jacobs absolutely dominates and has like 3 touchdowns, and Love only throws for like 1 or 2. That's the only way I don't think this works out. But I think it's worth betting on. I think the Cowboys are just that bad, and I think Jordan Love will play very well. Going into the bye in prime time, I think the Packers look excellent off the Browns loss. I think they remind everyone they're a Super Bowl contender. I think Jordan Love is a must start this week. At number 6, I got Caleb Williams at Las Vegas. And like I said, last week's matchup was just so elite. It was a no-brainer to start him, and he did pay off for me pretty much exactly what I expected. I ranked him top 3, and that was a very, very good call. So I do think Caleb is cemented into the top 10 for quite some time. However, I'm not fully of the belief that he is matchup proof. I think he's a bit matchup dependent, and that Cowboys game was an example of that. I think he could fall back down to earth easily against a tough matchup. But this week, he does not get one. The Raiders are also an upgrade. So I think Caleb is locked into the lineup, a definite top 10 starter. But because I think Dallas is so good, I would rather go Jordan Love and believe the Cowboys matchup is what you want to go after. I would rather go Jordan Love than Caleb this week. But Caleb does run the ball more. I think he'll be a very safe floor play every single week. I think he's a top 12 play at worst, even in a bad matchup. Undeniable upside from Caleb Williams. At number 7, let's go Justin Herbert at the Giants, who are a top 12 matchup this season for opposing quarterbacks. And they would be much higher on the list if they weren't so bad against the run. They cannot stop the run at all. So given it's a slightly older roster, going on the road on the East Coast in the early time window, they also had that Brazil game, and travel will be a factor for them throughout the year. I think if there was ever a game where they might lean on the rookie running back, it might be this one. Hampton should go off because the Giants are so bad at stopping the run. So that's my only reason to worry about Herbert. The touchdowns might go to Hampton all game long, but still Herbert has looked like an MVP candidate. He has 3 really good receivers to throw to, and I expect the floor to remain high. I think Herbert is bust proof, and if you drafted him, you're ecstatic. He's pretty much a must start all season. Definitely a top 8 quarterback this week. Have him at number 7. And at number 8, the last player in this tier, I think Bo Nix is an excellent start this week versus the Bengals. He's been up and down, but wasn't atrociously bad against the Chargers' elite defense last week. It's not like he had a Geno Smith game with 3 interceptions. And this week, he does get Evan Engram back on the field. The matchup is a cakewalk. Monday night versus the Bengals, I expect Sean Payton's offense to look really good. They have an extra day to prepare, and Bo Nix will torch them. The only downside is that the Bengals are similar to the Giants, terrible against the run, and there is the chance that J.K. Dobbins and R.J. Harvey drop a bunch of house calls, don't share any of the touchdowns. But Bo Nix can run the ball himself. I think he has a very high floor. I think he will go over 20 points. I think the ceiling gives him that 30-point upside. I trust the Broncos to really play well on offense against Cincinnati. So love him this week. I was tempted to rank him top 5, but he's been a little deceptively bad this season. Some spots we expect him to play well, he has not. So that's why I have him at the bottom of this tier, but I think he's a definite top 10 option this week. I love Bo Nix and the Broncos offense in week 4. I think they dominate, and I do think he's an interesting buy low candidate. He has a very good schedule moving forward. It really opens up after some tough games to start the year. So like Bo Nix, I think he's a good top 10 play this week. At number 8, I want him in the lineup. At number 9, I think the Rams matchup is a little bit of a red flag, but Daniel Jones has earned top 10 status. He's played so well. He also has dual threat ability. I think he can keep this game pretty competitive. I think even if the Rams drop 30 points, the Colts can keep up and turn it into a shootout. I think that the Colts offense will look good, but there is always the threat of Jonathan Taylor dominating, similar to Herbert and Bo Nix this week. I'm a little worried about the running back play. However, Daniel Jones has looked very competent. Shane Steichen's offense looks very good, and I do think they will keep up with the Rams. So I think Daniel Jones has earned a must-start categorization. In the top 10, I want him in the lineup. If I have him, I would start him. I think he's legit. At number 10, we got Patrick Mahomes versus Baltimore, and Mahomes did not need to run last week, so his ceiling did fall away, but the Ravens are going to keep the game much more competitive than the Giants did, and I also expect him to be the team's leading rusher once again. The Ravens are terrible at stopping the run, and I expect the Ravens to turn it into a shootout. So with the addition of Xavier Worthy back on the field, the ceiling is open for Mahomes once again. I think the floor is going to be there with the rushing stats. He should be fine. A top 10 play most weeks this season. I think it happens again against Baltimore. Their defense has been pretty trash so far this year. So I like Mahomes, a very safe play in my opinion. However, against the Ravens, in his last 3 games, he is only averaging 17.7 points per game, a bit more of a floor play against Baltimore. An average of 292 passing yards per game, only 7 rushing yards per game, and 5 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Definitely not his elite stats against Baltimore historically. So I do think he will look better than that based on his production this season. He's needed to run the ball, and I do think he'll offer at least 20 rushing yards. I think the scrambling will be on display in this matchup. So I think he's fine. I think the floor is safe. I would still start Mahomes. He's been relatively a good start in fantasy so far. Last week wasn't amazing, but this week I think he'll be better. At number 11, I am fading Baker Mayfield a little bit. The Eagles matchup a little scary. They can definitely step up on defense when they need to. However, it's mainly the fact that he loses Mike Evans. It's going to be much more difficult without him. So I think the passing game just isn't going to drop like 300 yards most likely, and I do think they lean on Bucky Irving and Rachaad White a little bit extra. But Godwin is expected to return. That does help Baker a little bit, but it's still going to be the Egbuka show for the most part. I think coming off the ankle injury, Godwin can't be expected to look like 100% of what he was last year. So there's upside every single week with Baker, but I think he's always a little touchdown dependent. And if he doesn't give you 3 passing touchdowns, I just don't think he goes over 20 points. So I still want to start him. It's hard to fade him. He's been really good ever since he's been a Tampa Bay Buck. And I do think the upside is still available. If it turns into a shootout, I wouldn't be surprised against the Eagles, but losing Evans is a factor. The Eagles can shut you down, and I think Bucky Irving does factor in a little extra. So just fading him outside the top 10, still a top 12 play. I would still keep him in the lineup, but if I had Daniel Jones, Bo Nix, Caleb Williams, Jordan Love, or Justin Fields, I think I would be benching Baker Mayfield this week. At quarterback 11, he's more of a streaming option than a lock in the lineup. At number 12, I think Jared Goff also deserves some heavy start consideration. He always looks amazing when he plays at home. For some reason, in the Dome in Detroit, he's just way better of a fantasy player than he is on the road. And that kind of makes sense. It's a good environment for him. However, it is stark. The contrast is pretty crazy. So maybe it looks like week 2 when they drop 50 points, but probably not. The Browns defense has looked somewhat legit this year, but the Browns are much better against the run than the pass. I still think Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra, and even Sam LaPorta will get going. So Goff can throw for 3 touchdowns easily anytime he plays at home. I think odds are that happens this week. Very high floor play in general. Goff does get close to about 20 points per game whenever he plays in Detroit. I think he's a definite top 15 option at the worst, and I will rank him top 12. I like his upside a lot in this matchup. At number 13, I think we're dropping down a tier, but we're still in the streaming conversation. I think if you need some depth pieces, maybe you still are trying to replace Joe Burrow or Jaden Daniels, you can look to the waiver wire and get some good options. I like Geno Smith a lot in this game. We saw his upside last week against Washington, and he looked like shit against the Chargers, but that's going to be the case for a lot of quarterbacks this season. The Chargers are not a good matchup, and Geno has good weapons. I think Bowers steps up. Although I think this is a great Ashton Genty game, the Bears are terrible against the run. They have a terrible defense in general, and they're pretty banged up in the secondary. I think Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers do play well, and if Trey Tucker scores another touchdown, we have some elite upside with Geno Smith. So I drafted him a lot in the summer. He was one of my favorite late round guys, and last week we saw the upside. He does have elite potential in good matchups. So I want to fade him in bad matchups, but against the Bears, this is a spot to upgrade him. I think he's a definite good start this week. He gets a top 5 matchup against Chicago. I'm going to believe that is an upgrade you want. So in Superflex, I think he's a must start in a 1 quarterback format. a good high-end streamer, definitely top 15 against Chicago, in my opinion. At 14, I'm going to go out on a limb and say Carson Wentz has a very good game in Ireland this week. The Steelers are a very old, aging roster. It's an early game window. They have jet lag traveling to Europe, and I think a ginger in Ireland is going to have some good luck. I do think Wentz will play well. He also gets Jordan Addison back, so that's going to open up things down the field. I think at least one of those deep shots will connect. He also had a very good connection with TJ Hawkinson, and after leaning on the run last week, maybe they do fade Jordan Mason a little bit in the overall usage. I do not fear the Steelers defense. They're not going to get gifted 5 turnovers. So I think it's an upgrade of a matchup. On paper, it ranks top 3, and I do think Carson Wentz will have some level of dual threat ability. I think him and Justin Jefferson going to look pretty good against Pittsburgh, and the extra weapons will also step up. I like Carson Wentz a lot in this game. So going to trust Kevin O'Connell, very high ceiling this week. I love him in DFS, and I think if you're streaming the position, I'd rather go Carson Wentz versus the Steelers than Marcus Mariota at Atlanta. Last week, Mariota, I told you to start him, and he did put up a similar stat line like last year, about 22 fantasy points. Odds are you're going to trust him again. The rushing stats are pretty viable to keep him in the high-end streaming conversation. However, the matchup against the Falcons is nowhere near as good as Carson Wentz against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Falcons rank bottom 5 against the position so far, and part of that was shutting down J.J. McCarthy, but even though the Panthers dropped 30 points on them last week, Bryce Young only had 12 fantasy points with a rushing touchdown. So I think this is a tough spot to be in. Losing Terry McLaurin is a big downgrade overall for the offense. And although Mariota does run the ball that keeps the floor high, I'm worried he doesn't throw more than 200 passing yards, and that just caps the ceiling. So he's going to need multiple touchdowns, and I'm not convinced that happens. I think there is some bust potential this week for Mariota, but in 3 starts with the Commanders, he's averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. I think at some point, you got to still respect that rushing value. It is a revenge spot for him. He used to play for the Falcons, and maybe he plays well against his former team. At number 15, I think the floor is safe enough where Mariota probably gets you 17, 18 points. But I am worried he does shit the bed against a bottom 5 matchup. Number 16, we got Matthew Stafford versus the Colts, and I think this game is likely a shootout against Indianapolis. So Adams and Puka keep the touchdown production pretty high. They are very safe bets in the passing game. And Stafford's been pretty solid, even though he doesn't run the ball at all. He rarely turns it over, and he also has very high shootout potential in this matchup. I think the odds of him throwing for 3 or even 4 touchdowns are actually pretty decent this week. I think the floor is pretty good. If he cracks 3 touchdowns, I think he goes over 18 fantasy points. So a good start. It'll all come down to touchdowns, but I think this is a game where I would like to trust him. At home off the Eagles loss, I think they step up and play pretty good on offense. I like Stafford as a low-end floor play in a Superflex league. I would start him. But at 17, behind the black line, I am telling you to bench all of these players, especially in a 1-quarterback format. I don't think they're worth it. And only in a 2-quarterback setting would I consider it. Kyler Murray, I did tell you to bench on Thursday night, and he's been consistently mid every single week. Not a total bust, but again, only 15 fantasy points. I think this ranking was perfect. I ranked him 17 entering the season, and he's doing just about exactly what I thought. Very average, mediocre fantasy stat lines from Kyler through the first 4 games. At QB 17, I was right to fade him. I'm also going to fade Drake Maye versus Carolina. He has some very high upside, but this is not that Dolphins matchup he got week 2. The Panthers have given up less than 10 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks so far. So not going to feel confident. Only in a 2-quarterback league would I trust him. And although the last 2 games, Drake Maye is averaging 38 rushing yards per game, that's kind of similar to Kyler, and it keeps the floor decent, but it doesn't always lead to an elite ceiling. I think the Panthers matchup could turn into a very low-scoring game. I am a bit worried. Not going to lie, I think this matchup is a legit downgrade. Last year, it was as well. So no thanks with Drake Maye at quarterback 18. I think he's going to hover around 16 fantasy points this week, but struggle to go over 20. not expecting an elite ceiling from Drake Maye. Number 19, I'm also downgrading Brock Purdy versus Jacksonville. And Purdy is expected to play, but he's not 100%. Meanwhile, Mac Jones is also banged up, so there's less of a threat that Jones keeps him off the field. But Brock Purdy does contribute in the run game generally. That keeps the floor pretty high. And if the toe injury is lingering, then I think you can kiss those 25 rushing yards per game goodbye. If that removes 2 fantasy points from Purdy's equation, his floor is significantly lower. I don't think he's a safe option anymore. There's also the injury to George Kittle that's a major factor. One of the safety blankets for Purdy unavailable. And then it looks like Juwan Jennings has yet to practice this week. I don't think he's going to play against the Jaguars. So you got to trust Ricky Pearsall and McCaffrey in the passing game. Beyond that, I don't know what you're getting. And the Jags have oddly been a decent defense this year. I don't think it's an elite upgrade like it has been in the past. So Purdy, I would like to see him fully healthy and playing well before I lock him into the lineup. I think at number 19, he's only viable in a super flex format. I don't think he's anywhere near as safe as he generally is. Coming off the toe and shoulder injury, I would fade him in this matchup. Not super excited to trust him in his first week back. At number 20, though, we got Tua Tagovailoa versus the Jets. And this is an upgrade. The Jets rank as a top 10 matchup so far. And the Dolphins also have extra rest, extra prep time for this game. They played last Thursday. A mini bye will help Tua get some good chemistry here. So the Mike McDaniel system, I think, will look good in the first half. The Jets have not looked very good on defense overall, so I think Tua will look fine. But then there's always the threat that he throws like multiple interceptions and just gives away the game. I think he'll look similar to the Bills matchup, but the interceptions can always crater him. And then there's always the threat that he doesn't finish the game because he suffers another concussion. I'm always afraid to start Tua for that reason. But the Jets on paper are a good spot. I think there'll be multiple touchdowns yet again for Tua, but in general, that's a hard bet to make. I still think the upside is pretty capped. You know he doesn't run the ball at all. But the Jets game, probably more of a high-scoring one. I think he's fine, but only in a Superflex league would I do it. At 21, the last starting option was Sam Darnold, who I was still not fully endorsing, but he does have now 3 straight games with 17 plus points. He has a decent floor, and this matchup for him was not an easy one. I think in good matchups, Darnold might crack the top 12 or at least top 15. I think he does have some safety high-end appeal moving forward, especially if Cooper Kupp can get going, and if Torrey Horton steps up as well, there is some upside for Darnold, but not a ton. He doesn't run the ball enough to definitely start. So at 21, I may have ranked him a little too low this week, but still earning my trust in Seattle. I'm not regretful for ranking him outside the top 20. Moving forward, though, I'm benching all these quarterbacks, even in a super flex league. I don't think it's worth it, but maybe you're desperate. Maybe you have to. I got Bryce Young at New England. He had a rushing touchdown last week, but still only 12 fantasy points, even though the team dropped 30 points. He's too inconsistent, not throwing the ball. It's very game script reliant, and he can definitely disappear at times. So the matchup is good, but I just don't feel great about it. I'd like to see Bryce Young be more consistent before I rank him in the top 15. At 23, we got Michael Penix Jr., who looked like shit last week, but the Commanders are a good matchup here, a decent spot to bounce back. And I do think at some point London and Mooney will get going. So the passing game will work out at some point, but for now, not enough confidence to trust him. And then Rattler does get an upgrade against the Bills. It's a top 5 matchup, but how much do you really trust Rattler? In general, there's very few touchdowns for the Saints to score. So not going to start him, but I am ranking him 5 spots higher than I normally do. And then Dak Prescott at 25 gets a major downgrade without CeeDee Lamb against the Packers. There's some legitimate shutout potential, but he probably plays okay in prime time, enough to move the ball, but not expecting many touchdowns. No fucking chance would I start him in a 1 quarterback league. At 26, I still don't trust Trevor Lawrence, very up and down, and the Niners defense is still one to fear. Even without Nick Bosa, I don't think I trust the Jags passing game at all. It's a steep mountain to climb to fix some of the issues they've had so far. At 27, I'm actually very interested in Jaxson Dart's long-term value, but this week in his pro debut, not going to start him against the Chargers. It's one of the worst matchups you could get. Chargers are probably going to force 3 turnovers against the rookie in his first game. I just don't see it. However, he does offer some legit rushing value. That is the only reason he's not ranked outside the top 30. At 27, there is some level of upside, but you got to see it before you pick him up. I don't think Dart has value in week 4. These last 5 quarterbacks, though, I think you're asking to lose. Aaron Rodgers is going to look very slow against the Vikings. I think they dominate the Steelers in Ireland. I think the jet lag is a big factor here for the veteran Pittsburgh Steelers. But in the second half, there might be some level of a comeback. There's some upside, but I think the first half is just so bad. It doesn't go over 15 fantasy points. Cam Ward and Stroud in a very ugly, low-scoring game. I don't want to start either of them. They've been pretty trash so far in fantasy up to this point. And then 31, we got Joe Flacco at Detroit. I know they won last week, but I've seen enough. I'm ready for them to start one of the rookies. And in the touchdown department, I think they prioritize the running backs more than passing the ball. This game is probably going to be 50-10 against Detroit in the Lions home stadium. So no thanks with Flacco. He could lose his job at any point. And then Jake Browning, even with some good weapons, I think is going to be terrible against Denver. I have no desire to trust Jake Browning. I have very little faith in Cincinnati rest of season. And now let's pivot to the tight end position, where I'd also like to bring in the best and worst matchups overall. I don't think I fully buy into all these numbers because it's only 3 weeks in. However, there are some matchups I would like to believe are good upgrades. Like on this chart, we have the Steelers as the clear best matchup so far. So TJ Hawkinson looked legit last week with Wentz. I think he does deserve an upgrade. They give up 19 fantasy points to the position on average. I think Hawkinson has some legit value this week. Trey McBride got the second best matchup on paper last week, and he didn't find the end zone. He was actually held to limited yards per catch, but still went over 10 fantasy points as always. The third best matchup would be Miami, but I don't know if I trust the rookie Mason Taylor yet. On paper, though, it is an upgrade. Detroit was really susceptible last week to Mark Andrews, so Harold Fannin and David Njoku on paper get an upgrade, but I wish there was only one of them. It's a little too crowded in Cleveland to fully bet on. And then the next upgrade would be Cincinnati. They have been top 5 this season against tight ends, so maybe Evan Engram, now that he's healthy, does have that breakout game. I did think he had some value entering the year. So far, it's not been there, but I do think Engram could have a great game against the Bengals. They give up 13.2 points per game on average to the position, and nobody other than Engram at tight end is relevant in Denver. In Green Bay, that has been a good matchup so far, so Jake Ferguson, definitely a good start this week. Baltimore, also pretty vulnerable, so Travis Kelce, maybe an upgrade for him as well. And then Carolina, against Hunter Henry, has also given up over 12 fantasy points per game to the position. Then there is Washington and Chicago, who both give up 11.4 points. So Kyle Pitts against the Commanders and Brock Bowers against Chicago should also play pretty well. And then the last two that give up more than 10 points would be San Francisco and the Giants, who go up against Brenton Strange of the Jaguars and Oronde Gadsden of the LA Chargers. So those are the best matchups so far, all giving up over 10 points to the position. But keep in mind, this is not just to one player who plays at tight end. It's every tight end that goes up against them. These stats are still being hammered out. I'll give you a bit more nuanced takes on this position as we go forward. Once the touchdowns start to emerge pretty consistently, we'll know who the best of the best matchups are. In general, you want to be chasing touchdowns, not just points at tight end. But the final matchups on the board are looking pretty bad. Like the Falcons only allow 2.6 points per game to opposing tight ends. So Zach Ertz, I'd be worried about. I don't think I would trust him with Mariota. He didn't look as good in week 3. And then Juwan Johnson on paper gets a big downgrade against Buffalo, but he's been so heavily targeted, I think I would still keep rolling him out there. And then the Chiefs and Eagles give up 4.8 points per game on average. So the combo of Andrews and Isaiah Likely on paper gets a downgrade, so does Cade Otton against the Eagles this week. And then the Jets have also been bad, but against Tanner Conner, no one's starting a Dolphins tight end. Las Vegas also giving up only 5.5 points, so I wouldn't trust Cole Kmet or Loveland just yet. That's a weird tight end room in Chicago. And then Cleveland is technically a downgrade against LaPorta, but Goff always plays well at home, so there's still some touchdown potential. Goedert also gets a tough matchup against Tampa Bay. And then the last one that gives up less than 7 points per game would be Jacksonville against Jake Tonges. I don't think anyone is starting Jake Tonges. So that's it for the tight end matchups. And now let's rank the position where I'm not going to make any changes in the top two. I'm going to stick with Bowers and McBride, the guys we drafted at the top this season. And I think Bowers at some point will look fully healthy against the Bears in an upgrade of a matchup. I think he'll soon enough look like his old self. The value that went to Trey Tucker will find Bowers pretty quickly. So I'm definitely never going to bench him. I want him in the lineup, and I think he does look like that tight end one, at least in the next few weeks. Maybe the knee injury is still lingering, but I trust Bowers at some point to fucking dominate. In week 1, he had over 100 yards against the Patriots. He will get back to that sooner or later. So I did rank him above McBride, but I told you to start McBride, of course, on Thursday night. And he wasn't the most efficient, but had 11 targets. He was still pretty good. Anytime you go over 10 points at the position, you are winning the week at tight end. In the next tier, though, I think Tucker Kraft is going to have an elite game as long as he's healthy, and he was practicing in limited capacity. I think he will be fine against Dallas. The Cowboys' defense is atrocious, and while I don't fully trust a clear number one receiver for Green Bay, I think Kraft at tight end is a must start. He looked so good in week 2 with 124 yards. I think he'll look similar to that in this game, but the knee injury is a factor similar to Bowers. It's possible it takes a while for him to be 100%. Maybe I'm overestimating him, but against Dallas, I think Jordan Love is going to crush, and I want his top target. I expect Kraft to find the end zone. Jake Ferguson in the same game also gets an upgrade on paper. It does rank as a top 6 matchup against the Packers. Against tight ends, they've been a little vulnerable. So I think Ferguson is a lock in the lineup. He now has 32 targets on the season with Lamb going down. He'll be the top target most likely, if not number 2 to George Pickens. And last week he had 14 targets while Lamb was out. But the week before that, he had 12 targets and Lamb was active. So his role isn't going anywhere. It's absolutely legit. And I do think Dak will look okay, not completely dog shit, on Sunday night in primetime. I think they won't score many points, but they will move the ball, and Ferguson will get double-digit targets. So have to start him. I was tempted to rank him even higher, but the Packers could blank the Cowboys. There is some shutout potential, and that's why the touchdown I don't think is a guarantee for Jake Ferguson, like I think it is for Tucker Kraft. At number 5, Dalton Kincaid has been a very good start this season, and I think you can attribute to that to him taking over as the number 1 target in Buffalo. Last year it was Shakir, but Khalil Shakir was injured in the preseason, so I think the practice reps really benefit Kincaid and his chemistry with Josh Allen. And you know the Bills are always going to score a lot of touchdowns. So if Kincaid is the top weapon, have to start him. I think he's earned, at worst, top 10 status rest of season, but at number 5 this week, I think he's a lock in the lineup versus the Saints. I do want to start him, like I will every week. I don't think you want to be fading Kincaid based on the start he's put up in fantasy so far. A very safe play at the moment. At number 6, Juwan Johnson in the same game, also a very safe play. Even though the Bills on paper are a big downgrade, I don't fully believe that yet. It's too early in the season for that to be a lock. And Juwan is just getting too many targets to bench. His chemistry with Rattler goes back last year, and it's not going anywhere. Rattler really trusts him. So I think he's continued to be a must start. The volume has been very safe. And although there's not many touchdowns, the floor is always going to be there. Juwan will probably give you 50 plus yards every single game on like 5-6 catches. I don't think the volume will ever go away. So I think he's this year's Johnny Smith. If you picked him up off the waiver wire, congrats. If you drafted him, then you are a very, very sharp drafter. Let me know if anyone has Juwan Johnson because they drafted him. Odds are you picked him up off the waiver wire after week 1. At number 7, though, I'm going to keep starting Tyler Warren. I know last week was a little disappointing, but he is leading the Indianapolis Colts in targets, and I do trust that this game is more of a shootout against the Rams. So I think there's, at worst, top 10 value for Warren this week. There is some high upside. I think he could find the end zone. Similar to Goedert last week on a deep touchdown, that is possible. The Rams have been a little vulnerable to tight ends dating back to last season. So I do think Tyler Warren is a safe floor play every single week. I'm not going to worry even though last week wasn't amazing. The volume is going to be there more consistently than most other options at the position. I would still start Tyler Warren. At number 8, I would keep LaPorta in the lineup, especially playing at home. I trust Jared Goff to throw multiple touchdowns, and odds are one of them does go to LaPorta. However, the Browns do have a good defense. They're much better against the run, however, but they do rank as a downgrade against the tight end position. I mentioned it. They are a bottom 8 matchup this season. It is pretty touchdown dependent when it comes to LaPorta and his success. So I could be wrong about this. LaPorta might burn you, but I think he finds the end zone. I think Goff looks good, and I do think the Lions offense is one I want to bet on. So give me LaPorta as a top 10 play this week at number 8. I would keep him in the lineup. At number 9, I'm going to start TJ Hawkinson versus the Steelers. Last week was encouraging. The pivot to Carson Wentz seemed to save the offense a little, and he had good chemistry with Wentz. He scored a touchdown, and he did not look washed like he did in the first 2 games. So not only is that encouraging, like I mentioned, this matchup is elite. It's the best on the season so far. The Steelers allow 19 points per game to the position opposite them at tight end. So I don't think Josh Oliver is going to be a problem here. I think Hawkinson will get some targets and does have that touchdown potential in this spot once again. So I think in Ireland, I think Wentz looks good. I think Hawkinson is a top 10 play. A similar stat line is what I'm projecting. Like last week, I think he does go over 10 fantasy points, but maybe after the first 2 games, you don't trust him as much. That's why I could not rank him above Tyler Warren or LaPorta. We'll see what happens, but I think he's a top 10 play this week against Pittsburgh. Number 10, I got Dallas Goedert at Tampa Bay, and last week wasn't the safest stat line, only 1 reception, 1 target, but it was a 33-yard touchdown, and that is valuable. He had a very good game in week 1, and I do think he's a solid part of this passing game. I think the floor remains high for Dallas Goedert, but it's mainly just the position that starts to fade quickly beyond this point, why I'm ranking him top 10. If Kittle was active, then Goedert would be out of the top 10. So good luck. There is some risk here, but I do think there's some shootout potential, and I do think he will be involved against Tampa Bay. I don't think he completely gets burned with limited volume. I think he does factor in yet again. I think his usage will be fine in fantasy moving forward. At number 11, we're dropping down a tier, and there is some risk factor. We've seen some dud games from all these players, but last week Andrews popped off in a major way. I was wrong to fade him, and I don't want to be completely fooled by just one good game, but obviously Andrews has a long career of touchdown success. The Chiefs matchup is bad on paper so far, but last year Isaiah Likely did torch them, and this week it looks like Likely is coming back to the field. So it's possible my concerns last week are going to happen where Likely does steal the tight end 1 job from Andrews, but coming off the foot injury, odds are he starts a bit slow, and odds are Andrews is still the best tight end in Baltimore. But there is risk. The first 2 games were atrociously bad, and if you get completely burned, it wouldn't totally shock me. But last week was so good, I think you probably regretted benching him. Odds are you didn't start him last week because it was just so bad in the first 2 games. But I think with the fear of missing out yet again, I would probably put him in the streaming conversation. At number 11, I guess you should start him, but I am still worried, especially with Likely expected to return. At number 12, we got Hunter Henry versus Carolina, who had a great game as well last week, but the week prior, Austin Hooper was more involved than he was, and there still is bust potential with a random target share in New England. But last year he was Drake May's favorite target. I think he still is, and we saw some elite upside potential. I think he'll be a weekly top 15 option at tight end, a weekly streamer, but not a guaranteed top 10 play. He has upside, but not a guaranteed floor. It will be up and down week to week. That's kind of how the position is in general, unless you have someone like Trey McBride. So good luck with Henry, but definitely worth a roster spot at the very least. High upside, but a little hard to trust consistently. At 13, we have Travis Kelce versus Baltimore, and he's entered the touchdown-dependent discussion. I just don't think he's a locking the lineup anymore. He's going to be 36 in a few weeks, so I don't fully trust him. The Ravens are probably going to keep this game interesting and competitive, so maybe there's a touchdown for Kelce, but he only has 1 on the season, and sometimes he does let you down with some drops. So not the safest bet. I would rather not lock him into the lineup, but from a safety net standpoint, the floor is decent. he's in the streaming conversation. Number 13, you can definitely start with some level of confidence. But at number 14, this is definitely a gut call here. I am saying Evan Engram is worth a stream start in week 4. I think the first 2 games were partly due to his injury. Last week, he sat out entirely, and getting the rest, I think, will help him. He's active this week. He was already full in practice. He's off the injury report. So I think he will play very well against the Bengals. It is a top 5 matchup for him against the position, and I do trust that Bo Nix will get him involved. I think this offense is going to bounce back in a major way. They've been a bit disappointing through the first 3 games. So with an extra day to prepare, Engram, I think, gets the benefit of Sean Payton's coaching. And while he may not score a touchdown, I think the floor is going to be there. I think the yardage will look good for Evan Engram. I think the volume will carry him to at least 7 fantasy points. I think the floor is high. And there's also some elite upside. I think he could really dominate. The Bengals have been really bad against tight ends so far. So I like him a lot, but obviously it's just a gut call. There has not been any data to support this ranking. Engram has been trash when active so far this season. But at some point, it will click. I do still have some optimism that my preseason take on Engram will pay off. I ranked him top 10 coming into the year. So far, that's been a bad decision. Next up, though, I think we're dropping down a tier, and it's low-end streaming territory. Pretty touchdown dependent, but maybe you have more confidence than I do. At 15 and 16, I have the 2 Browns tight ends, Harold Fannin and David Njoku. And if you told me that one of them got injured or got traded, then the other one would have top 5 value. I think they would be just as good as Juwan Johnson if there was only one of them in this offense. But because there's 2, it's hard to know what you're going to get from each specific guy, and there's few touchdowns to go around in Cleveland in the first place. So I don't really trust Joe Flacco. The Lions matchup on paper is really good. They gave up 2 touchdowns to Andrews last week, and maybe they play really well, and I'm underestimating them. But I don't feel like there's that much of a ceiling. The touchdowns are going to be few and far between, and other than like a 6-7 point floor, I don't really know what you're getting from the Browns tight ends. They're talented, they're valuable, but they eat into each other's production, and that is why I'm not that inspired. I did drop Fannin in the subscriber league. This morning, I picked up Evan Engram, and I'm going to start Engram above Fannin against the Bengals. So I am a little worried rest of season. I wish there was only one tight end in Cleveland. If that was the case, I'd trust them a lot more, but still, I think the floor is okay against Detroit. But knowing who scores a touchdown is a fluke. I wouldn't bet on that with any confidence. At 17, Zach Ertz has looked amazing with Jaden Daniels, but not as good with Mariota last week. And with Mariota this week, I don't think I would trust him. The Falcons have been the worst matchup on paper so far. Ertz is pretty touchdown dependent. I don't want to start him, but there's always the chance he finds pay dirt yet again, especially with Terry out. That's definitely a possibility for Ertz to step up. At 18, I have Cade Otton versus Philadelphia, who probably has to step up with Mike Evans going down. However, Chris Godwin expected to return. The Eagles haven't been the best matchup either, so pretty touchdown dependent as well. Maybe it works out, but odds are I wouldn't trust him. Last year, however, when Evans was missing, he was really effective in that offense. But Godwin was also missing. This year they have Igbuka, and now Godwin's active. I'd like to see Otton have a high target share before I rank him in the top 12. But there is some upside. I could see him score even 2 touchdowns against Philly, let alone 1. Baker is always a good quarterback to bet on. After this point, though, I'm definitely benching everyone moving forward, but Isaiah Likely, a player I want to keep an eye on. I expect him to suit up. He's been limited in practice all week, just like last week, and I think he plays against the Chiefs. He torched them last year, but in his first game back, I think it's too soon to bet on him. Okonkwo, I think, is a underrated floor play. I could argue he should be ranked in the top 15, but I'm not going to do it. Against the Texans, I think he will need to step up. I think they'll limit Ridley yet again. Brenton Strange in the same conversation, also a high floor play with decent targets, but I just don't love Jacksonville. I worry about the touchdowns for both the Jaguars and the Titans, so that's why Okonkwo and Strange are outside my top 18. But if you wanted to rank them where I rank Evan Engram, I could understand that argument. I might be too low on Strange and Okonkwo. Same with Kyle Pitts. I might be too low on him, but I just don't love what I'm seeing from Penix so far. And until we get some touchdowns from Pitts, I just don't want to bet on him. In general, that's a very bad bet to make. Pitts is not a high touchdown guy. And then lastly, Cole Kmet is entering the conversation. I still worry about Loveland, but Kmet is at least on the radar. So is Jonu Smith, but this is a bad game for the Steelers this week. I'd like to fade Jonu, not my favorite spot to start him. And then last week, Oronde Gadsden, with Dissly out, did have 7 targets. This week, Will Dissly is out yet again. So it looks like he's better than Tyler Conklin, but only one game is not enough of a sample size. I'm keeping an eye out on Gadsden. The rookie might have some value in LA. And then lastly, Mason Taylor on paper gets a very good upgrade in terms of the matchup. The Dolphins have been bad against the tight end. So maybe Taylor does play well, but the rookie is still too young, too unproven to start. At 26, not going to put him in my lineup. So that's it at tight end. Now let's talk about the defensive position, where the top 2, I think, are locks in the lineup. We have the Chargers at the Giants against Jaxson Dart. It's a rookie quarterback making his debut. I definitely want to trust that. There's multiple turnover potential for the Chargers. Definite pick 6 upside. And then the Packers against Dallas are going to play well on Sunday night. Micah Parsons' revenge game off the Browns loss. You know they'll play well without CeeDee Lamb. The Cowboys don't have much juice. So I think the Packers have the higher floor, but the Chargers have higher upside. If you want to start either of these two, it is pretty clear that the best plays overall. I'm actually in a predicament. I have both the Chargers and the Packers in the subscriber league, and I'm actually not sure who I'm going to start. I think I'm going to go Chargers against Dart, but they travel on the East Coast in the morning. Meanwhile, the Packers play Sunday night on the road at Dallas. I don't think I can go wrong with either, but I am actually not totally sure which one I want to start. I think I'm going to go Chargers. That is how I rank it. Chargers above the Packers. At 3, we got the Vikings versus the Steelers, an aging veteran roster on the other side with jet lag. Sign me up. The Steelers should struggle all game. I think Brian Flores' defense really steps up. They've been pretty good all season so far. And then at 4, we get the Broncos versus the Bengals, and the Bengals do have weapons, and Denver has been disappointing in fantasy so far. So I was tempted to put him at number 1, but I think top 5 is still a pretty good upgrade. I'm definitely starting the Broncos. On paper, they should crush the Bengals. At number 5, I think the Bills are still a good start. Last week, they were not. I ranked them top 5, and they did let you down, but they get extra rest. They played last Thursday, and Rattler is coming to town. I think that's definitely a good spot. I think the Bills will look better on defense. I think here against New Orleans, it is an upgrade. I want to chase. Give me the Bills as a top 5 play. I also told you the Seahawks were a top 6 play. I told you to start them on Thursday night, and that was a good call. In the subscriber league, they scored 13 points, and that will be top 10 on the week for sure. At 7, we get the Texans and Titans at number 8. I think both teams in this matchup are going to have a high floor. It's going to be a very gross, low-scoring game. The Texans are the better unit against a rookie quarterback, so definitely a high floor play. But right behind them, I think the Titans are actually going to win the game, and Stroud has not looked good. The Houston offense has looked like shit. And interestingly enough, the Titans are 5-1 on the road at Houston in the last 6 years. They actually play very well against Houston in their home stadium. So like both of them this week, I think they're both top 10. The floor is very high in this game. At number 9, I got the Lions versus Cleveland. The Browns are always a good matchup, and the Lions usually step up at home. So there is blowout and shutout potential against Joe Flacco. And then at number 10, even though they lost Nick Bosa, I still think the Niners have a decent floor. I think the Jaguars do not inspire much confidence on offense, so I think the Robert Saleh defense can step up and put up some decent stats. I think turnovers are still viable against the Jaguars. I trust their coordinator, even without Nick Bosa. Number 11, though, I think we're in the streaming conversation. These next 6 are the floor plays I would start if I'm lacking one of those elite options. The Falcons and Commanders game should be kind of gross as well. Atlanta, I think, will bounce back. A revenge game for Mariota, but I think their defense in the pass rush does limit him, and I think they get enough sacks where they keep the floor pretty high. But the Commanders do have some upside. They have a relatively okay defense, and Penix looked like shit last week, but Bijan can always torture you, so not my favorite play, but in the top 12, I think it's a low-scoring game in general. Should have a fine access to a floor. And then 13, I have the Rams, who are a little too talented to fully fade, but their cornerback situation isn't the best. They did get torched last week by A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, but I think against Daniel Jones, they'll look a little better. I think from a floor standpoint, I don't want to drop the Rams, so I would still consider them a decent start. And then same goes with the Bucks and Eagles. I think they're too good where I want to be dropping them. Unless I have an elite pickup like the Chargers or Packers, I would probably just stick with the Bucks and the Eagles. It is probably a shootout, so maybe not the best, safest play, but they're both good defenses, and it could be more of a turnover battle in this matchup. But in general, I don't think they have the best upside. Both offenses are really good, so I have the Bucks and Eagles barely in the top 15. And then the last one I thought was maybe worth a start was the Cardinals last night, and they put up 6 points. That's fine, but nothing special. This rank will probably look pretty decent on the end of the week. But 17 through 20 got the Jags, Panthers, Patriots, and Jets. I don't really know what to make of that Panthers-Patriots game. It could be a shootout, could be a very low score. I'd rather just avoid it. And then the Jags have surprisingly been good this season on defense, but against Kyle Shanahan's offense, I'll bet against it. McCaffrey probably goes off. And then the Jets have been pretty underwhelming, but Tua can always gift you some turnovers. That is possible to bet on with the Jets. And then beyond the top 20, no chance I'm starting them, but the Steelers might step up. They had 5 turnovers against the Patriots last week, but I think they start off really slow with some jet lag in Ireland, so I'll pass. The Colts against the Rams, I don't want to bet against McVay, so no thanks there. The Chiefs and Ravens game is probably a shootout, so no thanks with either of them against good quarterbacks. And then in the next tier at the Browns, Raiders, Bears, and Dolphins. The Browns defense is good, but Detroit has a knack for dropping 50 at home against bad teams, so I'm going to pass. The Raiders and Bears game is probably not going to have much defense, so I'll avoid that. The Dolphins are on their last breath, and they're not going to stop Justin Fields, so no chance with them. And then I think the Giants, Cowboys, Bengals, and Saints, my bottom 4 tier, you're asking to lose with those 4 teams. Terrible matchups for them. They've looked like shit on the season. Not going to start them this week. So these are my top 22 at the 3 positions this week at quarterback, tight end, and defense. I feel really strong about the top 12 quarterbacks, but I even think Geno Smith, Carson Wentz, Mariota, and Stafford have high stream appeal this week. I think they will all go over at least 16 fantasy points with that 20-point upside. But in general, I would be benching them for guys in my top 12. I think Justin Fields has an elite game this week against Miami. I love Jordan Love against Dallas this week. Caleb has earned must-start status. So has Justin Herbert. And Bo Nix, I think, will bounce back against the Bengals. I think he looks really good. I trust Daniel Jones at this point. Mahomes will probably run the ball more this week. Baker, always got to start him, but losing Mike Evans does deserve a downgrade. And then Goff always plays elite at home. Those, I think, are the top 12 quarterbacks, the guys I trust the most. But I'm not too excited about Kyler, Drake May, Purdy, Tua, and Darnold. And although Darnold was decent, I was right to fade Kyler. None of them, I think, will go over 18 points this week. At tight end, I think, obviously, the top 6 have earned your trust. Kraft, Ferguson, Kincaid, and Juwan Johnson are looking like really, really safe tight ends this season. But Warren, LaPorta, Hawkinson, and Goedert, I think, have played well enough so far and get good matchups. They are worth a start. Andrews, Henry, Kelce, and Engram are my favorite streamers this week, but you could also talk me into Fannin all the way through Pitts. I think even the top 22 have some level value, but I don't think they have enough to be locks in the lineup. I think beyond Engram, I'd probably bench everyone at tight end. But at defense, I'm trying to start the top 10 with some confidence. I like all of them this week. Some good upside for each of them. But outside the top 10, I think it gets pretty ugly, and I'd probably just stick with teams like the Rams, the Bucks, and the Eagles instead of dropping them for teams like the Falcons, Commanders, even the Titans. I probably would still leave on the waiver wire. But if you're desperate, plug them in. If you have the Chargers or Packers, I think you're going to dominate in week 4. So that's it for the video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I'll see you tomorrow with my injury updates and final rankings at every position. If you don't want to miss out, ring the notification bell, and I will see you tomorrow. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.